Hello everyone, Gabriel Clevenger here, pastor at the table. So today is the first day of the season of Advent, first Sunday of Advent. This is actually the beginning of the Christian year. We start with reflection, waiting, and a serious practice of anticipation. Now, if you haven't yet read the passages for today, pause this here and go read them so you have them fresh in your mind, and I'll see you right back here in just a minute. Okay, welcome back. So, we find that waiting and anticipation in our lives are not things that we're often prompted to do in our world, right? I mean, waiting for something important is a lost art in many ways. Everything about the world we live in is set up for us to avoid waiting. We don't even want to have to wait to find out if someone liked that post on Instagram, right? I mean, we have to have the instant notifications coming up on our phones. My kids will never know the exquisite agony of having to leave someone a message on their home answering machine and then having to wait until they actually got back home to get the message and then sometime later call me back. You know, it can start a fight nowadays for a text to go unanswered for a couple of hours, or horror of horrors, to be visibly left on read and not replied. Now, there's a reason advertisers and product providers have worked hard to eliminate waiting. It's because it's unpleasant. We don't ever wake up and think, man, I really hope I have to wait a few more days about that decision. As a child, I would begin thinking about Christmas really early. I don't know if you did, but I would begin working on my wish list and then paring it down to the most realistic list, that I could find. Every morning I woke up in December, I wished that it was Christmas Day until the afternoon of Christmas Day, and all of a sudden I wished that it hadn't passed yet. The folks who sell us things don't want us to have to wait for things, so they have developed ways to keep us looking for small doses of pleasure coming in constantly. Have you ever noticed that you can watch a news station for hours and really not find out anything else new? There's something that happens to us in this process. And in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Neil Postman calls this the now this effect. You can be watching a short story piece about something really awful that just happened in Eastern Europe, then have the news anchor transition you with nothing more than a now this to hearing about your local weather, and then 6 seconds later you're watching a commercial about toothpaste. It is emotional, really spiritual whiplash. In being uncomfortable with silence or waiting, we have allowed our minds and spirits to be filled with constant cycling noise, persistently pulling us one way and then the next. And this is not healthy. Eventually, you're scrolling through headlines or social media posts, constantly looking for something to really matter for longer than 2 minutes, and you never really find it. It's hard to imagine waiting being beneficial or formative in our world, because it seems like a mortal enemy of our age. But it is formative. And it can be in a good way. It matters what you're waiting for, though, right? In our passage from Isaiah today, we read a kind of a compressed story of God's people to that time in which it was written. God had entered into history and had done unbelievable things. God's people were feared because of God. Isaiah 64 verse 4 reads, "From ages past no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eyes have seen any God besides you, who works for those who wait for him." And yet, things had turned for disadvantage for these same people. As verses 5 and following show us, those people had sinned, and it seemed that God was far away. But even in the midst of that, verse 8 tells us, "Yet, O Yahweh, you are our Father. We are the clay, you are the potter, we are the work of your hands." They're having to deal with the discomfort of having to wait, of having to dwell with the uncertainty of how God would handle the current circumstances. But even in the middle of all that, they are able to say, "You are our Father. You are the potter, and we are the clay." You're doing something, we just don't know what it is. The other passages for today deal with God's presence with us too. The psalm is asking for God to show up and change the situation. In 1 Corinthians, Paul is affirming God's presence with his people to develop and to grow them. And the passage from the Gospel of Mark emphasizes to us how close we should always assume God is to showing up. But it's no fun to wait. It's uncomfortable. It's unpleasant. But that's what makes this kind of waiting so valuable, when you're waiting for God to show up in your life. You see, we can never get to longing without waiting. We can never get to valuing something really highly without having to wait for it. But my talking about this won't actually convince you, and I know that. Waiting is the only appropriate teacher for this. Waiting is the only path to this realization. Only waiting itself can provide the space and the way for reflection, for God's presence to really break into our consciousness through the too easy and the too thin availability of what this world has to offer in advertising and cheap stuff. So, I'm both asking you to let these scriptures speak to you today, and I'm inviting you to do some active waiting. Now, I can hear you asking, well, what is active waiting? What I mean is for you to be intentional about creating space in your heart, in your mind, a routine to act out this waiting. If you haven't seen or heard yet, we at the table are offering you a way to put into practice loving God and loving neighbor actively and leaning into the waiting by practices of embracing some things and avoiding others. You're welcome to join us for these special Advent groups for these next few weeks. You're invited. We will have different groups meeting in different areas, so there should be one close to you. Please contact me here for more information or to let me know how we can pray for you during this time. Even in the midst of a year like this one, there's something that I know, of which I am very confident, that God is near, that He is watching over you, and that He is working and inviting all of us to be a part of what it is that He is doing. God bless you, and I will see you soon.